Good evening, and welcome back to Boring Bible Stories for Sleep. Tonight we are settling in with one of the longest, slowest, most layered stories in all of Scripture. The entire story of David, the shepherd boy from Bethlehem who became the most famous king in the history of ancient Israel. A man of songs and silences, of long wandering years in the wilderness, of a throne he waited for longer than most men wait for anything. A man who was called a friend of God, and yet lived a life so full of contradiction, so heavy with both joy and grief, that even after thousands of years his story still breathes. As always, let me know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Whether you're in a warm bed with rain on the window, or stretched out on a couch somewhere quiet, or perhaps driving home on an empty road in the dark. Wherever you are, I'm glad you are here. Get comfortable. Breathe slowly. Let your shoulders drop. We have a long way to travel tonight, and none of it needs to be rushed. Let's begin. Before we arrive at David himself, we must understand the world he was born into. Because David did not appear in a vacuum. He arrived at a particular moment in a long and winding story. And to understand why his life unfolded the way it did, we need to know something of what came before him. The people of ancient Israel, in the centuries before David was born, lived under a system of leadership that was unlike anything we would recognize today as a government. They were guided not by kings, but by figures called judges. These were men and women who arose in times of crisis, called by God or by circumstance to deliver the people from one danger or another. Some of them were military leaders. Some were arbiters of disputes. Some were, by any honest accounting, complicated and flawed human beings who stumbled into moments of greatness and then stumbled back out again. The era of the judges was not a peaceful one. It was a long, cyclical period of forgetting and remembering, of the people drifting away from their traditions, encountering hardship, crying out for help, being delivered, and then slowly drifting away again. The pattern repeated itself with a kind of quiet exhaustion, like a tide that comes in and goes out, but never quite reaches the shore it is looking for. By the time the prophet Samuel was born, the system was beginning to show its age. Samuel himself was one of the last great judges, a man of remarkable integrity and spiritual sensitivity, who served the people faithfully from his youth until deep into his old age. He walked the circuit of the land year after year, settling disputes and offering guidance, and the people trusted him. But Samuel had sons, and his sons were not like him. They took bribes. They perverted justice. They were, in the quiet language of the text, not walking in their father's ways. And the elders of Israel, watching this, began to worry about what would happen when Samuel was gone. Who would hold things together then? And so they came to Samuel with a request. Give us a king, they said. Give us a king like all the other nations have. A man who will go before us into battle. A man who will rule over us. Samuel did not like this. He prayed about it. And the answer he received was nuanced and a little melancholy. The people are not rejecting you, Samuel was told. They are rejecting me. They want to be like other nations. Let them have what they are asking for. But warn them first. Tell them what a king will cost. And Samuel did warn them. He told them exactly what a king would demand. Their sons would serve in his armies. Their daughters would work in his kitchens. Their fields and their vineyards and their olive groves, the best of them would be taken. The king would take a tenth of everything. He would take their servants and their cattle and their donkeys. And one day, Samuel told them, "You will cry out because of the king you have chosen." And on that day, God will not answer. The people listened to all of this and said, "We still want a king." So a king was found for them. His name was Saul, from the tribe of Benjamin. He was a head taller than anyone else in Israel, handsome and impressive, a man who looked on the outside exactly like what people imagined a king should look like. Samuel anointed him. The people celebrated. Saul began to rule. For a while, it seemed like it might work. Saul had moments of genuine leadership. He rallied the tribes. He won battles. There were years of relative stability and something that might, if you tilted your head at it in the right light, resemble peace. But Saul had a fragility inside him that the weight of the crown slowly cracked open. He was a man who feared what other people thought of him more than he feared anything else. He was a man who could obey instructions in broad outline, but who struggled when the details became inconvenient. He was a man who, when he made a mistake, was more interested in managing how the mistake appeared than in genuinely accounting for it. Twice, in significant moments of testing, Saul chose the appearance of compliance over its substance. Twice he was told that his disobedience would cost him, and the message that came back to him, delivered by Samuel, was one of the most quietly devastating sentences in the whole of the Hebrew Scriptures. Because you have rejected the word of God, God has rejected you as king. Saul did not stop being king immediately. He continued to sit on the throne for years afterward. But something had shifted in the invisible architecture of things, the way a beam in an old house can crack without the house itself falling, until one day it does. The spirit that had been with Saul began to depart from him. In its place came something darker. The text calls it an evil spirit, a spirit of distress. Saul began to have episodes of something that today we might call severe depression, or perhaps something more erratic, more disorienting than that. He would fall into dark moods that nothing could reach. He would rage without warning. He would sit in silence for hours with a heaviness that pressed down on everyone around him. This is the world David was born into. A kingdom already quietly broken at its foundation, held together by the presence and reputation of a king who was slowly coming apart from the inside. And somewhere in Bethlehem, in the household of a man named Jesse, a boy was growing up with no idea that any of this had anything to do with him. Bethlehem was not an important place. It was a small town in the hill country of Judah, a settlement that had its name and its modest history, but nothing about it announced greatness. It was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, where the rhythms of planting and harvest governed the shape of each year, where life was ordinary in the way that most life, for most people throughout all of history, has always been ordinary. Jesse was a man of that town. He had 8 sons. The eldest 3 were old enough to serve in Saul's army, and when the time came, they went. The youngest, the 8th, was still at home. He was out in the fields most of the time, keeping his father's flocks. He had the particular kind of solitude that comes from long days alone with animals, far from the noise of the household, under an open sky. His name was David. We were told a few things about him in those early pages. He was ruddy in complexion, with bright eyes, and he was handsome. He was strong in the way that outdoor labor makes a person strong, with a wiry endurance rather than brute size. He had developed, in those long, quiet hours on the hillsides, a skill with the harp, and a habit of singing. He composed poems to himself, or to the sky, or to whatever it is that young people alone in open spaces direct their inner voices toward when no one else is listening. He had also, by necessity, become something of a fighter, not because he was trained for war, but because the job of shepherd in the ancient world occasionally required you to protect your flock from things that wanted to eat them. David would later tell a story, almost casually, of the times a lion or a bear had come after the sheep, and how he had gone after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on him, he seized it by its jaw and killed it. He said this not to impress anyone, but simply as evidence that he had experience with danger and had not been destroyed by it. There is something in that detail that tells us who David was even as a boy. Most people, faced with a lion coming for the flock, might have made a reasonable calculation about the relative value of a sheep versus their own continued existence. David did not make that calculation, or if he did, he made it differently. The sheep were his responsibility. The flock was his charge. Something in him could not let the loss go unanswered. He was out in the fields one day, a day like any other, slow and warm, the sheep grazing in the way sheep always graze, without urgency, when word came that he was wanted back at the house. A visitor had arrived. Something was happening. The visitor was Samuel. The old prophet had come to Bethlehem under somewhat cautious circumstances. He had been told to go, and he had been given a cover story. He was there to offer a sacrifice, because if Saul heard that Samuel was going around anointing a new king, Saul would kill him for it. The political situation had grown that delicate. Samuel was no longer simply a spiritual figure operating in a neutral space. He was a man navigating a court that had become paranoid and dangerous. He arrived at Jesse's house and asked to see Jesse's sons. Jesse brought them out. The eldest came first, and he was impressive. Tall, strong, the kind of young man who fills a doorway. Samuel looked at him and felt something stir in him that he might have mistaken for confirmation. But the instruction he received, quietly and internally, was clear. Do not look at his appearance or his height. I have rejected him. The way the humans see is not the way that God sees. Humans look at the outward appearance. God looks at the heart. And so the eldest was not the one, nor the second, nor the third. One by one, 7 sons of Jesse passed before Samuel, and one by one the answer was the same. Not this one. Samuel turned to Jesse. Are all your sons here? Jesse paused. Well, there is still the youngest. He is out keeping the sheep. Send for him. There's a small, quiet moment here that is easy to pass over, but worth sitting with. Jesse had not thought to bring David. When a prophet of Samuel's stature came to your house and asked to see your sons, you brought your sons. The ones who were men, the ones who were ready, the ones who were part of the active life of the household. The youngest, the one still doing the child's work of watching the flocks, the one who had not yet grown into whatever role the family imagined for him. That one perhaps did not come to mind. David was, in the most ordinary and unremarkable sense, an afterthought. But he was sent for, and he came. And when he walked in from the fields, still carrying the smell of grass and open air, still with the unself-consciousness of someone who had been alone all day and had not yet adjusted back to being observed, something settled. This is the one. Samuel took his horn of oil and anointed David in the middle of his brothers. The text says that from that day forward, the Spirit of God came upon David with power. And then Samuel got up and went home to Ramah. And the story moves on as if nothing extraordinary had just happened, because outwardly, nothing had. David went back to his sheep. Jesse went back to his life. The household of small man in an unimportant town resumed its ordinary rhythms. Nothing had changed, and everything had changed. While David was in the fields outside Bethlehem, Saul's condition was worsening. The dark episodes came more frequently now. The moods that descended without warning and lifted without pattern, leaving the king hollow and difficult to reach. His servants and advisors were a loss. Someone suggested music. There was an old understanding in the ancient world, and perhaps not such an old one after all, that music could reach places where words could not, that the right kind of sound could move something in a person that nothing else could touch. Someone knew of a young man in Bethlehem. He was said to be skillful with the harp. He was brave and capable. He was good-looking and intelligent. He was the kind of person, the report said, that God was with. And so David was summoned to the court of Saul. He came with gifts from his father, bread and a skin of wine and a young goat. And he entered the service of the king. He became one of Saul's armor-bearers, which was a position of genuine proximity. A young man trusted enough to stand close to the king, to carry his weapons, to be present in moments when the king needed someone at his side. And when the dark moods came, David played. Whatever it was that David played in those long evenings, whatever the music sounded like, whatever the words were, if there were words, it worked. Saul would be refreshed. The heaviness would lift. He would feel better. The evil spirit, as the text describes it, would depart from him. There is something worth lingering over in this image. The most powerful man in the kingdom, a man who had won battles and commanded armies, sitting in the grip of something he could not control. And a shepherd boy from Bethlehem playing a stringed instrument until the king's mind grew quiet again. Saul loved David very much during this period. He asked Jesse to let David remain in his service permanently. He was, it seemed, genuinely attached to this young man who could reach him when nothing else could. This is how David first entered the world beyond Bethlehem. Not through war, not through political maneuvering, not through ambition. Through music, through the particular gift he had developed alone on the hillsides, playing to himself and to the sheep and to the open sky. He had no idea what was coming. He was simply doing what he knew how to do. The period of court service seems to have been interrupted, or perhaps it was a more occasional arrangement, because the next major episode in David's story finds him back home, doing the same work he had always done. The three eldest brothers are away with Saul's army. Jesse asks David to take some provisions to them, roasted grain and loaves of bread and 10 cheeses for their commander, and to bring back word of how they are doing. It was an errand, a supply run, the kind of thing a youngest son gets sent to do. David left the sheep with a keeper, loaded the provisions, and set out early in the morning. He arrived at the camp to find both armies facing each other across the valley of Elah. Israel on one ridge, the Philistines on the other, the valley between them, in a situation that had been going on for 40 days without resolution. Because the Philistines had a champion. His name was Goliath. He was from Gath. He was enormous. The text gives measurements that translate to somewhere around 9 feet tall. Those scholars debate the exact numbers. He wore a bronze helmet and a coat of scale armor that weighed something like 125 pounds. He carried a bronze javelin, a spear with a shaft like a weaver's beam, and a sword. And he had a shield bearer who walked in front of him. Every morning and every evening for 40 days, Goliath had come out and issued the same challenge. Choose a man and send him out to fight me. If he kills me, we will serve you. If I kill him, you will serve us. Why should the whole army have to fight? Let it be decided between one man and one man. And every morning and every evening, the Israelite army looked at this enormous man standing in the valley below, heard his voice echoing up the ridge at them, and trembled. The text uses a specific word. They were dismayed. They were terrified, not just cautious, not just concerned, terrified. And no one in 40 days had stepped forward. David arrived in the camp, found his brothers, started to greet them, and heard Goliath coming out with his morning speech. He listened. He looked around at the men of Israel pulling back up the ridge, each man retreating with the look of someone who had just remembered somewhere else they needed to be. He asked the men standing near him what was going on. What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine? He wanted to know. What will the king give him? The answer was significant. The king would give great wealth. The king would give his daughter in marriage. The king would exempt the family of the man from all taxes in Israel. David kept asking. He asked more than once. He phrased the question slightly differently the second time. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? His eldest brother, Eliab, overheard this and was immediately irritated. Why did you come down here? Who have you left the sheep with? I know your conceit and the wickedness of your heart. You just came to watch the battle. This is a small moment, but a quietly revealing one. Eliab speaks to David the way a certain kind of older sibling speaks to a younger one who is showing them up without meaning to, with a contempt that has more than a little anxiety inside it. You're just a boy. You have no business here. Go back to your sheep. David did not argue. He simply turned away from Eliab and asked someone else. Word got back to Saul that there was a young man asking about Goliath, and Saul sent for him. David stood before the king and said, simply, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. Saul looked at this young man, this boy, really, and said what anyone would have said. You are not able to fight this Philistine. You're just a young man. He has been a warrior from his youth. And here David told his story. The lion, the bear. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The God who delivered me from the lion and the bear will deliver me from this Philistine. There is no performance in this account. There is no bravado. David is not boasting. He is simply making an argument based on evidence he has personally collected in the field over years of solitary labor. He has encountered lethal danger before. He has survived it, not because of his own strength alone, but because of something that showed up alongside his strength and made it sufficient. Saul looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, Go, and the Lord be with you. He tried to equip David with his own armor, a bronze helmet, a coat of armor. David put it on and tried to walk in it. He had never worn armor before. He could not move properly in it. He took it off. He would go as himself. He picked up his staff. He went down to the stream and chose 5 smooth stones, putting them in his shepherd's pouch. He took his sling in his hand, and he walked toward Goliath. Goliath saw him coming and was insulted. He looked at this boy, this ruddy, handsome, entirely unarmored boy, and he was offended. "Am I a dog," he called out, "that you come at me with sticks?" And he cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "I will give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David answered him. And the answer is worth reading slowly, because it contains everything that David believed at the core of himself. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." Then he ran. He ran toward Goliath. He reached into his bag, took out a stone, put it in his sling, and let it fly. The stone struck Goliath in the forehead. The giant fell forward, face down on the ground. David ran to where Goliath had fallen, took the Philistine's own sword from its scabbard, and with it cut off his head. When the Philistine army saw what had happened to their champion, they turned and fled. The Israelites surged forward, chasing them, and it was a great victory. David stood in the valley with Goliath's head in his hand, and the world would never look at him the same way again. There is a particular kind of pressure that fame applies to a young person, especially fame that arrives suddenly, without preparation, before they have had time to develop the scaffolding to hold it up. David did not seek what happened next. He did not campaign for it. He did not plan a path to prominence. He threw a stone because it needed throwing, and the stone found its mark, and afterward the world rearranged itself around him whether he wanted it to or not. Saul brought David to live permanently at the court after the battle. He would not let him return to his father's house. David moved into a new life, a life of proximity to power, of military service, of public visibility. He was given a position over the men of war. He went out on campaigns. Whatever Saul sent him to do, he did, and he did it successfully. The text notes, with a kind of understated precision, that he behaved wisely in all his ways. It was during this period that one of the most important relationships of David's life began. Jonathan, the king's son, watched what David had done that day in the valley, and something happened inside him. The text describes it as Jonathan's soul being knit to David's soul, and Jonathan loving him as his own soul. He gave David his own robe. He gave him his tunic, his sword, his bow, his belt. These are not just gifts. In the symbolic language of the ancient world, a prince giving his weapons and clothing to another man was a gesture of profound significance, an acknowledgement, perhaps intuitive and perhaps quite deliberate, that this man mattered in a way that could not be fully articulated. They made a covenant together, a formal binding of their friendship into something that had the weight of a promise before God. Jonathan was Saul's heir. The throne, in the ordinary course of things, should have passed to him. He must have understood, at some level, what his father's unraveling meant. He must have seen the direction things were going. And yet his response to David was not rivalry or suspicion. It was love. Immediate, uncomplicated, self-giving love. This friendship would sustain David through some of the darkest years of his life. But that was still ahead. For now, everything was bright, except for one thing. The armies were coming home from the battle, and women came out of all the cities of Israel to meet them, singing and dancing, with tambourines and songs of joy and with musical instruments. And they were singing back and forth. And one of the verses went, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. Just a song, just a call and response between women celebrating a victory. Just the particular rhythm of a folk celebration that needed a shape, and this shape came naturally from what everyone had seen. But Saul heard it, and something changed in him, the way weather can change, the way a sky that was clear an hour ago can suddenly be the kind of sky that means something is coming. He has credited David with tens of thousands, Saul thought, but only thousands to me. What more can he have but the kingdom? From that day forward, Saul kept a suspicious eye on David. It would have been possible at this point for things to go differently. Saul could have recognized the jealousy forming in him and chosen not to feed it. He could have remembered that David had been nothing but loyal, that David had saved his reputation, that David had done everything asked of him. He could have looked at his son Jonathan's love for this young man and taken it as testimony to David's character. He did not do any of these things. Instead, the next day, when David was playing the harp in the palace as he had done many times before, Saul picked up a spear and threw it at him. He threw it twice. He was trying to pin David to the wall. David evaded him both times. Saul's attempt to kill David with the spear was not a sudden act of madness. It was the first visible expression of something that had been building for a while, and it did not stop there. What followed was a long, slow campaign of pressure and danger, a series of maneuvers in which Saul tried to arrange David's death without appearing to be the one arranging it. He was afraid of David. The text tells us because God was with David but had departed from Saul. And so instead of simply sending David away or confronting him directly, Saul began to maneuver. He removed David from his immediate presence. He made him a commander of 1,000 men, which was an honor and also a way of putting some distance between them. He gave David military assignments that were, without being obviously suicidal, dangerous enough that there was a reasonable chance he might not come back. David came back. Every time. He was successful in everything he did, and the text notes that all Israel and Judah loved him because he led them in their campaigns. The more Saul tried to diminish him, the more David seemed to grow. The more danger Saul sent him into, the more he returned from it intact. Saul had promised his daughter to the man who killed Goliath. He offered his eldest daughter Merab to David first. David declined with what seems like genuine modesty. "Who am I," he said, "and what is my family, that I should become the king's son-in-law?" Merab was given to someone else. Then Saul heard that his younger daughter Michal was in love with David. And he thought, this is useful. This is a trap I can set. He offered Michal to David, but with a specific bride price, not wealth, but the foreskins of 100 Philistines, proof of 100 kills in battle. Saul said to himself, I will send David against the Philistines. Let the Philistines deal with him for me. David went out, and he and his men killed 200 Philistines. He presented the full count to the king. Saul gave him Michal as his wife. The trap had not worked. Saul told Jonathan and all his attendants to kill David. Jonathan, who loved David as his own soul, went to David and warned him. He also went to his father and spoke on David's behalf. He reminded Saul of what David had done for him. The Philistine victory, the service at court, the loyalty that had never wavered. He appealed to Saul's better instincts, the ones that were still accessible, still reachable, in the moments when the darkness was not pressing down so hard. Saul listened. He swore an oath. As the Lord lives, David shall not be put to death. David came back to court. There was peace for a while. He sat in the palace again and played the harp when Saul's moods required it. And for some stretch of time, things were as they had been before. And then there was another battle, and David was successful again, and the evil spirit came upon Saul again. And he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand, and David was playing, and Saul threw the spear at him again. This time David fled. He ran to his house. Saul sent men to watch the house and kill him in the morning. Michal heard about this and came to David. "You have to get out tonight," she told him. "If you don't leave tonight, you will be dead by morning." She helped him through a window. She put an idol in the bed, covered it with a garment, and put goat's hair at the head of it, and told the messengers that David was sick. When Saul found out what had happened, when he realized David was gone, he was furious with Michal. "Why have you deceived me like this?" And Michal said to her father, "He told me he would kill me if I didn't help him," which may or may not have been true. But she said it, and she survived, and David was gone. He ran to Samuel in Ramah. He told him everything that had happened. Samuel took him to a place called Naioth, and they stayed there together. Word got back to Saul that David was at Naioth with Samuel, and Saul sent messengers to bring David back. But when the messengers arrived and encountered the company of prophets who were there, something overtook them. They began to prophesy. They could not do what they had come to do. Saul sent more messengers. The same thing happened. Saul went himself, and even Saul on the way, even Saul was overtaken by the same spirit. He lay down and prophesied all that day and all that night. David was gone by then. He had gone back to find Jonathan. "Jonathan, do you know your father is trying to kill me?" Jonathan's first response was disbelief. He could not bring himself to believe it. "My father does nothing great or small without telling me. Why would he hide this from me? It cannot be true." David said, "Your father knows very well that I have found favor with you." He has said to himself, "Jonathan must not know, because he will be grieved." But truly, as God lives, and as you live, there is only a step between me and death. They worked out a plan. There was a feast coming, the new moon celebration, and David's presence was expected at the king's table. David would not go. Jonathan would tell Saul that David had gone to Bethlehem for a family sacrifice. If Saul accepted this explanation calmly, then perhaps things were not as dangerous as David feared. But if Saul became angry, then they would know. They agreed on a signal. Jonathan would go out to the field where David was hiding and shoot 3 arrows, and depending on where he told his servant to find them, closer or farther, David would know whether it was safe to return. But first Jonathan said something to David that does not read like strategy or logistics. It reads like a man trying to name something that does not fit into ordinary categories. He said, "Go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord," saying, "The Lord is witness between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever." The feast came. Saul noticed David's absence on the first day and said nothing. On the second day, he asked Jonathan where David was. Jonathan gave the agreed explanation. He had gone to Bethlehem for the sacrifice. Saul's anger flared immediately, and he said something to Jonathan that was ugly and cruel, an accusation designed to shame and wound. He said that Jonathan was bringing disgrace on himself and on his mother, and that as long as David lived, Jonathan would never be established. "Go and bring him to me," Saul said, "for he must die." Jonathan stood up to his father. "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" Saul threw a spear at Jonathan, his own son. He threw a spear at his own son. Jonathan got up from the table in fierce anger. He did not eat for the rest of the day. He grieved for David. He grieved for the shame that had been brought on David. And the next morning, he went out to the field. He had a young servant boy with him. He shot 3 arrows. He called out to the boy to retrieve them, directing him farther, farther. The arrow is beyond you. And then he sent the boy back to town. When the boy was gone, David came out from behind the stone where he had been hiding. He came to Jonathan, and they embraced each other and wept together. And David wept the most, the text says, with a grief that had no bottom to it. Jonathan said, "Go in peace. The vow we have made, the two of us, in the name of God, let it stand between us and between my descendants and your descendants forever." Then David got up and left, and Jonathan went back into the town. They would see each other once more, briefly, in the wilderness of Ziph. Years later, when Jonathan would come to find David and strengthen his hand in God and remind him that he would one day be king, and that Jonathan himself would be second to him. But this moment in the field, this farewell with arrows and weeping, was essentially their last real time together. Everything after this, for David, would be flight. What followed was not a brief interruption in David's life. It was years, long, difficult, dangerous years of living as a fugitive in his own land, moving from one hiding place to another, never fully safe, never able to stop moving for long. He went first to a place called Nob, to the priest Ahimelech, and here we see something of the desperation of his situation. He had left Jonathan's presence with nothing, no weapon, no food, no companions. He came to Ahimelech with a story he seems to have invented on the spot, something about a secret mission from the king, and he asked for bread and whatever weapon might be available. The bread was the consecrated bread from the tabernacle, which according to the law should only be eaten by the priests, but Ahimelech gave it to him. The only weapon available was Goliath's sword, which had been wrapped in a cloth and kept there behind the ephod ever since the day David had brought it back from the valley. Ahimelech gave David that too. David took them and went on. He was in a kind of survival mode now, improvising, making do, the long-range plans of a future king temporarily set aside in favor of the immediate need to stay alive. He went to Gath. This was, of all places, Goliath's hometown, a city of the Philistines who were Israel's enemies. He went there perhaps because it was the last place anyone would look for him, perhaps because he had no better option. But someone in the court of Gath recognized him. They said to their king, "Achish, is this not David, the king of the land? Is this not the one they sing about in their songs? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands?" David heard this and was afraid. He changed his behavior before them. He pretended to be insane, scratching at the doors, letting his saliva run down his beard. Achish looked at this scene and was exasperated rather than impressed. "Why would I want a madman in my house? Get him out of here." David escaped. He went to a cave called Adullam, and there's something remarkable began to happen. Word got out about where he was, and people began to come to him. Not a palace delegation, not an official party from the court. His family came, his brothers and his father's whole household, and then others came. everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was bitter in soul. They came to David, and he became their leader, and there were about 400 men. This is David's first real community outside of the court. A community of the marginalized, the desperate, the people on the wrong end of things. Saul's economic and military policies had created casualties, and the casualties were finding their way to the cave where the man Saul was hunting had set up camp. He took his parents to Moab, to the king there, and asked if they could stay in safety while he dealt with what he was dealing with. Then he and his men, 400 of them now, growing, moved through the wilderness, always moving, always watching the horizon. A prophet named Gad told him not to stay in the stronghold, but to go back to the land of Judah, and he went to the forest of Hereth. Meanwhile, back at Saul's court, there was a terrible thing happening. The priest Ahimelech, who had given David bread and Goliath's sword at Nob, had been reported to Saul by a man named Doeg the Edomite. Saul summoned Ahimelech and all the priests of his family and accused them of conspiracy. Ahimelech defended himself honestly and well. He knew nothing of any rift between David and the king. David had always been loyal. He had given him what he asked for in good faith. Saul ordered his guards to execute the priests. They refused. They would not raise their hand against the priests of God. Doeg the Edomite had no such hesitation. He killed 85 priests that day. Then he went to Nob, the city of the priests, and killed everyone there, men, women, children, infants, the cattle, the donkeys, the sheep. One son of Ahimelech escaped. His name was Abiathar, and he ran to David and told him what had happened. David received this news, and something in him shifted toward grief and guilt. I am responsible for all the lives of your father's family, he said to Abiathar. It is my fault. Stay with me. The man who seeks your life is seeking mine also. With me you will be safe. He carried that. He carried the weight of those 85 deaths and the deaths of everyone in Nob as something his choices had set in motion, even if another man's hands had done it. The wilderness years were not static. David and his band were not simply hiding. They were active, they were helping people, they were fighting when they needed to fight. Word came that the Philistines were attacking a town called Keilah, raiding their threshing floors, taking the grain. David asked God whether he should go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah. The answer came back yes. His men were nervous. They were already afraid just being in Judah, and going into direct confrontation with the Philistines seemed like an escalation of danger. David asked again. The answer came back the same. Go, I will deliver the Philistines into your hands. They went. They fought. They drove off the Philistines and saved Keilah and brought the livestock back. Then David heard that Saul, learning that David had gone to a walled city, was mobilizing his whole army to march on Keilah and trap him there. He consulted God again. Will Saul come down? He will. Will the men of Keilah surrender me to him? They will. So he and his men, 600 now, the group had grown, left the city and went back into the open wilderness. When Saul heard that David had escaped, he gave up the march. David moved from place to place in the wilderness of Ziph, in the hill country, in the strongholds, in the desert. Saul searched for him every day, but God did not give him into Saul's hands. It was in the wilderness of Ziph that Jonathan came to find him. Jonathan, in the territory his father controlled, moving through the dangerous middle space of a royal family that was consuming itself from within, found his way to David in the trees, in hiding, and strengthened his hand in God. He said what he believed with a simplicity that cost something in those circumstances. Do not be afraid. My Father's hand will not touch you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this. And they made their covenant again, the same covenant they had made before, renewed in a place of danger and uncertainty, in the wilderness, in the trees, while a king hunted them both. Then Jonathan went home to his father, and David remained in the wilderness. The people of Ziph sent word to Saul that David was hiding in their territory. Saul thanked them for their loyalty and sent them back to confirm the location. Come back and tell me exactly where he is, and I will go with you. I am told that he is very cunning. They were searching for David in the wilderness, and David was moving away from them. And Saul and his men were on one side of the mountain, and David and his men were on the other side. And it was the kind of pursuit where the distance was collapsing. Saul was circling around, closing in, and then a messenger came to Saul. Come quickly. The Philistines are raiding the land. Saul broke off the pursuit of David and went to deal with the Philistines. David went up from the wilderness and lived in the strongholds of En-Gedi. He had been saved by the Philistines, the very enemy whose head he had brought back from the valley. The ironies of David's life were already accumulating. En-Gedi sits at the edge of the Dead Sea, a place of surprising green in an otherwise bare and desiccated landscape. There are springs there and palms and the kind of unexpected lushness that makes a desert traveler stop and blink. There are also caves in the rocky hillsides above the springs, deep and dark and cool. Saul returned from the Philistine campaign, and someone told him where David was. He took 3,000 chosen men and went to look for David in the crags of the wild goats. He came to the sheep pens along the way, and there was a cave there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. He did not know that David and his men were hiding in the back of that same cave, far enough in that the darkness swallowed them. David's men whispered to him, "This is the day the Lord said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands. Do with him as you wish." David got up quietly and crept forward. He cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Then he went back to his men, and immediately he was troubled. His heart struck him, is how the text puts it. He said to his men, "God forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to lay my hand on him. He is the Lord's anointed." He restrained his men. He would not let them rise against Saul. Saul left the cave and went on his way. Then David got up and called after him, "My lord the king." Saul turned. David bowed down with his face to the ground. He held out the corner of the robe. "Look," he said, "look at what I have in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but I did not kill you. Know and see that there is no evil or rebellion in my hands. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me to take my life." He spoke at length. He called himself a dead dog, a flea, nothing worth hunting. He appealed to God to judge between them and to see and plead his cause. "Let God be the judge," he said. "Let God deliver me from your hand." When David finished speaking, Saul sat with it for a long moment, and then he wept. He said, "You're more righteous than I. You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. You have just now told me about the good you did to me. The Lord delivered me into your hands, but you did not kill me." He acknowledged what had happened between them. He acknowledged David's restraint. He acknowledged that David would one day be king, that the kingdom would be established in his hands. He asked only one thing. When that day comes, when you are king, swear to me that you will not cut off my descendants and wipe out my name. David swore it. Then Saul went home, and David and his men went back up to the stronghold, the cave at En-Gedi, the robe with its corner cut, the opportunity taken and then refused. This is one of the central moments in David's story, and it tells us something essential about who he was and what he believed. He had Saul in his hands. His men were ready. The cave was dark and private, and no one would ever have known. He could have ended the whole long nightmare in a moment. He did not. Not because he was afraid. Not because he lacked the capability, but because of something he believed about power and about the proper way for power to transfer. Saul had been anointed. Whatever Saul had become since then, whatever damage had been done to his character and his reign, the anointing was a real thing that could not be undone by David's hand. David believed he would be king. He also believed it was not his job to make himself king. That was God's work to do in God's time. He could wait. He had been waiting for years. He could wait longer. There was a wealthy man in Maon named Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was intelligent and beautiful. He was harsh and mean in his dealings, a Calebite, and his name, which his wife would later point out with a kind of weary precision, meant fool. It was sheep shearing time, a season of celebration and abundance. David sent 10 young men to Nabal with a message. David had heard that Nabal was shearing his sheep. He appealed to the season and to the relationship they had. His men had been in the area. They had not harmed Nabal's shepherds. They had actually protected them. Could Nabal spare something for David and his men? It was a reasonable request. In the culture of the time, it was actually a fairly standard arrangement, a kind of informal protection service acknowledged on both sides, with payment expected at the seasons of abundance. Nabal's answer was contemptuous. Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Why should I give my bread and my water and my meat to men I do not know? David heard the report, and his response was immediate and hot. Strap on your swords. They strapped on their swords. David strapped on his. About 400 of them rode out, and David was saying to himself the kind of thing people say when they are genuinely furious, a grim accounting of what was about to happen to Nabal and every male in his household. One of Nabal's young servants had heard the exchange, and he went to Abigail and told her what had happened and what it was likely to set in motion. He was direct about Nabal. He is such a wicked man that no one could speak to him. Abigail did not waste time. She moved quickly, gathering an enormous amount of food, 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep already prepared, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 clusters of raisins, 200 cakes of pressed figs, loading it all on donkeys. She did not tell Nabal. She set out to meet David herself. She was coming down through a mountain ravine, and David and his men were coming the other way, and they met. She got off her donkey and bowed down before David with her face to the ground. She took the blame on herself. "Please," she said, "let your servant speak to you. Pay no attention to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him. The Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands." And she said something else, something that spoke directly to what David was carrying, to what the years in the wilderness were for. when the Lord has fulfilled for my Lord every good thing he promised concerning him, and has appointed him ruler over Israel. My Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed. This is a woman who understood exactly who David was and what was at stake, not just for this afternoon, but for the whole arc of his life. She was warning him gently and precisely not to acquire blood guilt on the way to becoming king. She was seeing the long picture clearly when he was seeing only the immediate anger. David listened to her. He received the food. He said, "Blessed be your good judgment, and blessed be you, who have kept me this day from bloodshed and from avenging myself by my own hand." He went back. He did not harm Nabal. When Abigail returned home, Nabal was having a feast and was very drunk. She told him nothing until morning. In the morning, when he was sober, she told him what had happened. His heart died within him. The text says, he became like a stone. 10 days later he died. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Blessed be the Lord who has defended the cause of my reproach at the hand of Nabal, and has kept back his servant from evil." David sent a message to Abigail and asked her to become his wife. She agreed. She came to him with 5 of her attendants, riding on a donkey, and she became his wife. David also had a wife named Ahinoam of Jezreel. And Michal, his first wife, Saul's daughter, Saul had given to another man. The details accumulate quietly. Wives and former wives, and the complications of a life in motion, a life that was not settled enough to be ordinary. The Ziphites went to Saul again. David is hiding on the hill of Hakilah. "Come down, and we will give him into your hand." Saul came with 3,000 chosen men. He camped on the hill, and his commander Abner was with him, and all his men were encamped around him. David looked down at the camp from a distance and noted where Saul was sleeping in the middle of the camp, ringed by his men. He asked 2 men, "Who will come down with me to Saul in the camp?" A man named Abishai, one of his fighters, said, "I will go with you." They went down together at night while everyone slept. They moved through the sleeping camp without waking anyone. They came to where Saul was lying asleep with his spear stuck in the ground near his head, Abner and the army sleeping around him. Abishai whispered to David, "God has given your enemy into your hand today. Let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear. I will not strike him twice." David said, "Do not destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As the Lord lives, the Lord himself will strike him, or his day will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and die. But God forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed." He took the spear and the water jug from near Saul's head, and they left. No one woke up. No one saw them. No one knew. David crossed back to the other side and stood on a hill at a distance and called out to Abner, "Abner, can you hear me?" Abner answered, "Who are you who calls to the king?" David called back, "Aren't you supposed to be guarding your king? Someone came to destroy the king tonight." Where the king's spear and water jug that were near his head, Saul recognized David's voice. "Is that you, David, my son?" "It is my voice, my lord and king." "Why is my lord pursuing his servant? What have I done? What wrong am I guilty of?" And Saul said, "I have sinned. Come back, David, my son. Because you consider my life precious today, I will not harm you. Surely I have acted like a fool and have been terribly wrong." David answered without softening, "Here is the king's spear. Let one of your young men come over and get it." The Lord rewards everyone for their righteousness and faithfulness. The Lord gave you into my hands today, but I would not lay a hand on the Lord's anointed." Saul blessed him. He said, "May you be blessed, my son David. You will do great things and surely triumph." Then David went on his way, and Saul returned home. Twice now. Twice David had held Saul's life in his hands, and twice he had set it down again. The robe in Engedi, the spear and water jug on the hill of Hakila. Two objects taken as evidence, held out in the darkness as proof of what could have been done and was not. This was not weakness. It was a form of extraordinary discipline, the discipline of a man who believed deeply in the proper order of things, who trusted that what was coming would come in its own time, who refused to reach ahead and grab it. And yet, even David was human, and the wilderness was long, and the patience required was enormous. The text tells us, quietly, David thought to himself, "One day I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand." He went to the Philistines. He went to Achish, king of Gath. He had been there before in the early days of his flight, when he had feigned madness to escape. This time he came differently, with 600 armed men and their families. He came as a force to be reckoned with, not as a fugitive. Achish gave him a town called Ziklag, and David and his men lived in Philistine territory for a year and 4 months. It was a form of exile within his own story. The man anointed to be king of Israel, living in the territory of Israel's enemies, doing what he needed to do to survive until the moment when everything would change. The moment was closer than he knew. David is in Ziklag. He is 30 years old, or thereabouts, living in a borrowed city in a foreign land, surrounded by his men and their families, waiting. He has been waiting for years. He was anointed in a field in Bethlehem when he was perhaps 15 or 16, a boy who smelled of grass and sheep, who had no idea what the old man with the horn of oil was setting in motion. And since that day, he has played the harp for a troubled king, killed a giant in a valley, made a friendship that became the closest thing his heart ever had to a home, been hunted across the length and breadth of his own country, twice refused to take the life of the man who was trying to take his, and ended up, somehow, in Philistine territory, living on the charity of his people's enemies. It is a strange road to a throne, but the throne is coming. The world is about to shift in ways that David cannot fully anticipate, in ways that will bring both everything he has been promised and griefs he has not yet imagined. The crown and the cost of it are still ahead. The fire is low in Ziklag. The desert is dark outside. Somewhere in that borrowed city, a young king who does not yet wear his crown is breathing slowly, waiting for a morning that will change everything. While David and his 600 men were living in Ziklag under the protection of Achish, king of Gath, the Philistines were assembling their armies for a major campaign against Israel. Achish expected David to ride with him. David gave a carefully non-committal answer. "You will see for yourself what your servant can do," and Achish took this as enthusiasm. But the other Philistine commanders were not comfortable with the arrangement. They did not trust David. They remembered the songs. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands, and they told Achish to send him away. What better way for David to win back favor with Saul, they argued, than to turn on the Philistine army in the middle of battle? Send him home." Achish, embarrassed, came to David and apologized. "The commanders don't want you here. I know you are good in my eyes, like an angel of God, but the commanders will not allow it. Go back. Go peacefully." David objected. He had given no reason for this distrust. But in the end, he and his men turned around and headed back south toward Ziklag. They arrived on the third day to find the city burned to the ground. The Amalekites had raided while they were gone. They had swept through the Negev and attacked Ziklag, burned it, and taken everyone captive, the wives, the sons and daughters of every man in David's company. Not killed, taken. They were prisoners somewhere in the desert. David and his men stood at the edge of what had been their home and looked at the smoke and the ash. And they wept until they had no more strength to weep. Then something shifted. The men, in their grief and their fury, began to talk about stoning David. He had brought them here. This was his arrangement, his decision, his leadership that had put them in a position where they rode off with the Philistines and left their families unguarded. This was his fault. They were bitter in their souls. The text says, every man grieving for his sons and daughters. David was grieving too. His two wives, Ahinoam and Abigail, were among the taken. But he did not fall apart. The text says, quietly and without elaboration, David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. He called for Abiathar the priest, the one surviving son of Nob who had fled to him years ago. He asked about pursuing the raiders. Should he go? Could he catch them? Could he recover everything? Go, the answer came. Pursue. You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue. David set out with all 600 men. They marched south and came to a ravine called the Besor, and there 200 of the men were too exhausted to cross. They stayed behind. The other 400 went on. They found an Egyptian in a field, a man who had been abandoned by his master 3 days ago when he fell sick, left in the desert without food or water, left to die. They gave him bread and water and figs and raisins. And when he had eaten and his strength came back, they asked who he belonged to and where he had come from. He was a servant of an Amalekite. He had been on the raid. He had been left behind when he got sick. He said, "If you swear to me that you will not kill me or hand me back to my master, I will take you to where they are." He took them. They found the Amalekites spread across the land, eating and drinking and celebrating, reveling in the great plunder they had taken. David and his men attacked at dusk and fought through the night and into the following morning, and they recovered everything. Not one person was missing, not a wife, not a child, not a single thing that had been taken. They also took vast amounts of the Amalekites' own flocks and herds. On the way back, there was a dispute. The 400 who had fought said that the 200 who had stayed at the ravine should not share in the recovered goods. They could have their wives and children back, but the plunder was for those who had actually gone into battle. David said no. The share of the man who stayed with the supplies is the same as the share of the man who went down to battle. They will share alike. It became a statute in Israel from that day forward. He arrived back at Ziklag, at the ruins of a city that was not even truly his, with everything recovered, and sent portions of the plunder to the elders of Judah and to the towns where he and his men had moved through during the wilderness years. A gesture of reconnection, a reminder to his own people that he was still there, still thinking of them, still coming. On Mount Gilboa, the battle that would end the age of Saul was already being fought. The Philistines pressed hard against Israel. The Israelite men fled before them. Many fell dead on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines killed Jonathan and 2 of his brothers, the sons of Saul. The fighting was fierce around Saul himself, and the archers found him, and he was critically wounded. He said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through. I do not want these uncircumcised men to come and kill me and abuse me." His armor-bearer was terrified. He would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. Jonathan died that day too. The prince who had loved David as his own soul, who had given him his robe and his weapons and his word, who had come to find him in the wilderness of Ziph and strengthened his hand in God, who had said, "You will be king, and I will be second to you." Jonathan died on Mount Gilboa with his father. The news came to David by way of a young man from Saul's camp, a man who claimed to have finished off the wounded king himself, who thought this report would earn him a reward. He arrived with his clothes torn and dust on his head, the signs of mourning, and he told David that Saul and Jonathan were dead, and that he himself had killed Saul because Saul asked him to, because Saul knew he could not survive. David asked him, "Were you not afraid to lift your hand and destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then he ordered the man executed. Then David mourned. He and all the men with him tore their clothes. They wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan and for the people of Israel who had fallen. They wept for the house of God's people brought low. And David wrote a lament. He ordered it taught to the people of Judah. It is called the Song of the Bow, and parts of it have survived, and they are among the most beautiful lines David ever wrote. He began, "How the mighty have fallen." He said of Saul and Jonathan, "They were loved and admired in life, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions." He said, "Daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold." And then he turned to Jonathan and said what he had never perhaps said so plainly before. "I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You are very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. How the mighty have fallen. The weapons of war have perished." The lament ends there, clean and final. He did not curse Saul. He did not rejoice. He did not say this was justice or prophecy fulfilled. He wept for a king who had spent years trying to kill him. And he wept without complication or reservation, because whatever Saul had become, he had also once been something else, something worth mourning, and David was not the kind of man who could not see both things at once. After the mourning, David asked God where he should go. To Judah came the answer, to Hebron specifically. David went up to Hebron with his 2 wives and his men and their families. And the men of Judah came to Hebron and anointed David king over the house of Judah. He was 30 years old. He had been waiting since he was a boy in Bethlehem. He had spent years in the wilderness. He had twice held Saul's life in his hands and set it down. He had lost everything in a fire and recovered it all. And now at last a crown, though not yet the full crown, not yet all of Israel. Just Judah. In the north, the rest of Israel did not come to Hebron. Saul's army commander, a man named Abner, took Saul's surviving son Ishbosheth and made him king over the northern tribes. Ishbosheth was 40 years old and had, as far as the record shows, no particular qualities of leadership. He was Saul's son, and Abner was loyal to Saul's house. and that was enough. There was a long civil war, not dramatic pitched battles, but a grinding, slow conflict, a series of skirmishes and raids and political maneuvering. The house of David grew stronger. The text says, and the house of Saul grew weaker. The direction of things was not in doubt. It was only a matter of time. But time has costs. People die in that time. Alliances are made and broken. Loyalties become complicated. Abner, the man holding the northern kingdom together through force of personality as much as anything else, had a falling out with Ishbosheth over something that reads, at first glance, like a minor court dispute, but carried enormous political weight in that culture. The argument was poisonous enough that Abner decided to change sides. He sent messengers to David. He would bring all of Israel with him. He would make a covenant and deliver the kingdom. David agreed, but with one condition: bring me my wife Michal, Saul's daughter, whom I married for 100 Philistine foreskins. There is something in this request worth sitting with. It had been years since Michal. Saul had given her to another man during the wilderness years, a man named Paltiel. Whatever love had passed between David and Michal, and there had been real love, or at least real feeling on her side, she had risked her life to help him escape. The years and the distance had complicated it. David's insistence on her return was partly political. A king married to Saul's daughter had a stronger claim to the northern tribes. But it may have been personal too. Michal was brought back. Her second husband followed her weeping all the way to Bahurim, weeping as he walked behind her, until Abner told him to go home. He turned and went back. Abner came to David in Hebron with 20 men and a feast. They made their agreement. Abner went north to bring the tribes. And then David's commander Joab came back from a raid and heard what had happened. Joab had a personal history with Abner. In an early battle, Abner had killed Joab's brother Asahel, killed him in the field, in combat, not in cold blood, but killed him nonetheless. Joab had been carrying that ever since. He went to David and challenged the agreement. He told David that Abner was a spy, that the meeting had been a deception. David does not seem to have agreed with this assessment, but Joab did not wait for David's answer. He sent messengers after Abner, called him back to Hebron, and when Abner arrived, Joab took him aside as if to speak privately with him and stabbed him in the stomach. David heard what had happened and was furious. He said publicly and clearly that he had no part in what Joab had done. He cursed Joab's household. He ordered mourning for Abner. He walked behind the bier himself at the burial. He sang a lament over Abner as he had sung over Saul. He said, "Do you not realize that a commander and a great man has fallen in Israel today? I am weak even though I am the anointed king. These sons of Zeruiah, Joab and his brothers, are too hard for me to handle." He did not punish Joab. He said he could not yet. He said he would leave it to God to repay the evildoer. It was a practical concession as much as anything else. Joab was too powerful, too connected, too useful in the immediate moment. But David knew what had been done, and he carried it. Shortly after Abner's death, 2 of Ishbosheth's own commanders killed him as he lay resting on his bed at midday. They brought his head to David, expecting a reward. David had them executed and buried Ishbosheth's head with honor. The civil war was over. There was no one left to hold the northern kingdom together. The tribes of Israel came to David in Hebron. They reminded him that even in Saul's time, it had been David who led them in and out, David who did the real work of protecting them. And they anointed him king over all Israel. He was 37 years old. It had taken 7.5 years from the day he was crowned in Hebron as king of Judah, and years more than that from the afternoon in Bethlehem when Samuel had poured oil on a shepherd boy's head in a field. David needed a capital. Hebron was in the south, too much associated with Judah, too partial a city for a king who now needed to hold north and south together. He needed something neutral, something that belonged to no tribe, something new. He chose Jerusalem. Jerusalem at that time was held by the Jebusites, an ancient people who had been there long before Israel arrived in the land, who had held the city through every war and every shifting of power, who believed their city was impregnable. They taunted David when he came. Even the blind and the lame can defend these walls against you, they said. David took the city. He took it through a water shaft, a tunnel that led up into the heart of the fortification, and his men poured through it. Jerusalem fell. He called it the city of David. He built outward from the fortress, filling in from the terracing inward. Hiram, king of Tyre to the north, sent cedar wood and carpenters and stonemasons, and David built a palace. A real palace, not a tent, not a cave, not a borrowed city. A house of cedar in the city that was now his. He defeated the Philistines twice, decisively, in the valley of Rephaim, breaking their power in a way that had not been accomplished before. He was consolidating, building, establishing. The kingdom was taking its shape under his hands. And then he turned his attention to something that mattered to him more deeply than any of the political or military achievements. He wanted to bring the Ark of God to Jerusalem, the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest that held the tablets of the law and that was understood to represent the presence of God among the people, had been sitting in a private house in a place called Kiriath Jearim for 20 years, largely forgotten during the chaos of Saul's reign. David wanted in Jerusalem. He wanted the city to be not just the political capital, but the spiritual center of the kingdom. He assembled 30,000 men, and they went to bring the ark. They put on a new cart and set out with music, lyres and harps and tambourines, and cymbals and singing, an enormous procession of joyful noise. On the way, the oxen stumbled. A man named Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark to steady it. The text says that God's anger burned against Uzzah, and he died there. David was both afraid and angry. Why had this happened? He left the ark where it was, in the house of a man named Obed-Edom, and went back to Jerusalem troubled. He stayed troubled for 3 months. But word came back to him that the household of Obed-Edom was being blessed from the day the ark arrived. God was not indifferent to the ark. The ark was not dangerous in itself. There had been a protocol for how it was to be moved, carried on poles on the shoulders of priests, not placed on a cart, and the protocol had not been followed. David understood. He had rushed it. He had not done it right. He went back for the ark, this time with all the proper arrangements. The Levites carried it on their shoulders as prescribed. Every 6 steps they stopped and sacrificed. And as the ark came into the city, David danced. He danced with all his strength, leaping and celebrating before God, wearing a simple linen cloth rather than his royal robes. He was not performing kingship. He was not managing how he appeared. He was simply overcome with something that did not know how to express itself except through his body, through movement, through the ancient human instinct to celebrate what cannot be contained in words. Michael was watching from a window. She saw her husband leaping and dancing in the street in front of all the servants and all the people, as she despised him in her heart. When David came home, she met him with contempt. "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today," she said, going around half-dressed in the sight of the slave girls of his servants, the way any vulgar fellow would. David answered her without apology. "I was celebrating before the Lord, who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house, when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor." The text notes, Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. It is a sad note. The marriage, whatever it had once been, was now something cooler and more distant. Two people who had loved each other across a great distance, and who, when the distance finally closed, found that they had become strangers. David was settled in his palace. The kingdom was at peace, or as near to it as the ancient world ever got. He was thinking one evening about the arrangement of things, and something struck him. He said to Nathan the prophet, who was with him, "Here I am, living in a palace of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent." Nathan, perhaps too quickly, told him to go ahead and do whatever was in his mind. God is with you. That night, Nathan received a message that complicated what he had said. Go back to David, he was told, and tell him, "You are not the one who will build me a house to live in." The reasoning given was layered and, at its heart, tender. David had been a man of war. He had shed much blood. The temple, when it was built, would be built by a man of peace, by David's son who would come after him. But the message did not stop at what David could not do. It went on to say what God would do for David instead. God would make David's name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. God would provide a place for his people. God would plant them so that they had a home of their own and would be disturbed no more. And then the promise went further still. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. David went in and sat before the Lord. He prayed, and his prayer is one of the most quietly moving passages in his story. A man sitting in the presence of something larger than himself, turning over the enormity of what he had just heard. Who am I, sovereign Lord, and what is my family, that you have brought me this far? And as if this were not enough in your sight, sovereign Lord, you have also spoken about the future of the house of your servant. He did not ask for more. He did not push. He simply sat with the gift of the promise and tried to find adequate words for gratitude, which is always the hardest thing to find words for. Then he got up and went about the work of being king. The years that followed were years of consolidation and expansion. David fought and won. He subdued the Philistines, defeated the Moabites, struck down the Arameans, defeated the Edomites. The kingdom grew. Tribute flowed in. Officials were appointed, a recorder, a secretary, priests, a commander of the army. The machinery of a real state was taking shape. David remembered his promise to Jonathan. He asked, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" There was. A servant of Saul's household named Ziba was found, and he told David that Jonathan had a son who was still alive. He had been 5 years old when the news came from Jezreel about Saul and Jonathan, and his nurse had scooped him up and fled, and in the panic and haste of that flight, she had dropped him, and he had been lame in both feet ever since. His name was Mephibosheth. David sent for him. Mephibosheth came and bowed down before David with his face to the ground. David said, "Mephibosheth." And the young man answered, "Your servant." David said, "Do not be afraid. I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." Mephibosheth bowed again and said, "What is your servant, that you should notice a dead dog like me?" David restored all of Saul's land to him. He called Ziba and his 15 sons and 20 servants and set them to farm the land for Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth himself came to live in Jerusalem, eating at the king's table like one of the king's sons. The promise made in a field, confirmed in a forest, sealed with a covenant between two young men who loved each other more than most people love. That promise was being kept years later in a palace. In the kindness shown to a lame young man who arrived at the king's table afraid. It was spring, the time when kings go out to battle. But David did not go. He sent Joab and his army to lay siege to Rabbah, the city of the Ammonites, and he remained in Jerusalem. One evening he got up from his bed and walked on the roof of the palace. Jerusalem was below him, the city that he had taken and named and built. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing. She was beautiful. He inquired. He was told, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Uriah was one of his own warriors. Uriah was at that moment with Joab at the siege of Rabbah, doing the work that David had sent him to do. David sent messengers for her. She came. He slept with her. She went home. She had been purifying herself from her monthly uncleanness. The text notes with a precision that matters. It means there could be no ambiguity about what came next. She sent word to David, "I am pregnant." David moved quickly to manage the situation. He sent for Uriah, brought him back from the front on a pretext, a report on how the battle was going. After the meeting, he told Uriah to go home. Go home and wash your feet, which was a way of saying, go rest, go be with your wife, go be a husband for an evening. Uriah did not go home. He slept at the entrance to the palace with all the king's servants. David was told about this and called Uriah back. "Why didn't you go home?" Uriah's answer was simple, and it fell in the room like a stone. "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents," he said. "Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house to eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." David kept him another day. He invited him to eat and drink with him, and he made him drunk, even drunk. Uriah went back to sleep among the servants and did not go home. The next morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by Uriah's own hand. The letter said, "Put Uriah out in front where the fighting is fiercest. Then withdraw from him, so he will be struck down and die." Joab did it. In the assault on the city, Joab arranged for Uriah to be at a place where the defenders were strong. Some of David's men died in the fighting. Uriah the Hittite died too. Joab sent a report back to David. He instructed his messenger that if the king was angry about the losses in the assault, the messenger should add, "And Uriah the Hittite, is dead too." David received the report. He said to the messenger, "Say this to Joab, do not let this thing distress you. The sword devours one as well as another. Press the attack. Encourage him." Bathsheba heard that her husband was dead. She mourned him. When the mourning was over, David had her brought to the palace, and she became his wife. She bore him a son. The text ends this section with a single sentence, sparse and devastating. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. Nathan the prophet came to David. He told him a story. "There were two men in a certain town," he said. "One was rich with very many sheep and cattle. The other was poor and had nothing except one little ewe lamb. He had raised it from birth, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him." A traveler came to the rich man. The rich man did not want to take from his own flock to prepare a meal for the traveler. Instead, he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it. David burned with anger at the story. He said to Nathan, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay back 4 times the amount for the lamb, because he did it and had no pity." Nathan said, "You are the man." He laid it out without softening it. God had given David everything: the kingdom, the wives, the palace, the protection, the victories. And it was not enough. Why did you despise the word of God by doing what is evil in his eyes? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. He named the consequences that would follow. The sword would never depart from David's house. Evil would be raised up against him from within his own household. David said, "I have sinned against the Lord." Nathan said, "The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die, but because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die." The child became ill. David fasted and prayed. He lay on the ground overnight. The elders of his household came and tried to get him up, and he refused. On the 7th day, the child died. The servants were afraid to tell him because they said, "Look how he was when the child was alive. What will he do when we tell him the child is dead?" David saw them whispering among themselves and understood. "Is the child dead?" he asked. "Yes," they said. "He is dead." David got up from the ground. He washed. He changed his clothes. He went into the house of God and worshiped. Then he went home and asked for food, and he ate. His servants were confused. "You fasted and wept while the child was alive, but now that the child is dead, you get up and eat?" David said, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. I thought, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me and let the child live. But now that he is dead, why should I go on fasting? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." Then David comforted his wife, Bathsheba. He went to her, and she conceived again and bore a son, and he was named Solomon. And the text notes, "The Lord loved him." The sword will never depart from your house. Nathan's words were not metaphor. They were a description of what was coming, and what came was terrible, and it came from inside David's own family, from his own children. David had many sons by many wives, and the complications of a polygamous royal household were not abstract. They were political, emotional, and ultimately violent. His eldest son was Amnon. Amnon developed an obsession with his half-sister Tamar, the full sister of Absalom, one of David's other sons. The obsession was so intense that it made him physically ill. A cousin helped him devise a scheme to get Tamar alone, pretending to be sick and asking the king to send Tamar to prepare food for him. Tamar came. She made bread for him. He sent everyone out, and then he seized her and raped her. Immediately afterward, the text says, the hatred Amnon felt for her was greater than the love he had felt. He had her thrown out of his house. Tamar put ashes on her head and tore her ornamental robe and went away, weeping. She lived as a desolate woman in her brother Absalom's house. Absalom said nothing to Amnon, neither good nor bad, but he hated him. David heard what had happened and was furious, but he did not punish Amnon. Because he loved him, the text says, for he was his firstborn son. 2 years passed. Absalom waited. Then he arranged a feast, a sheep shearing celebration, and invited all the king's sons. And when Amnon was drunk, Absalom's men struck him down and killed him. The other sons fled. Absalom fled to his mother's people in Geshur and stayed there for 3 years. David mourned for Amnon, and then, in time, the text says he longed for Absalom. His heart went out to his exiled son, the brilliant and beautiful Absalom, who had avenged his sister and then disappeared across the border. Joab, who understood the king's heart even when the king would not act on it, arranged for Absalom's return. He brought him back to Jerusalem, but David would not see him. He told Joab, he must go to his own house. He must not see my face. Absalom lived in Jerusalem for 2 years without seeing his father. He sent for Joab twice to intercede for him, and twice Joab did not come. The second time, Absalom had his servants set Joab's field on fire to get his attention. When Joab came, Absalom said, "Why have I come back from Geshur? It would have been better for me to stay there. Let me see the king's face, and if I have done wrong, let him put me to death." Joab went to the king. The king summoned Absalom. Absalom came and bowed down with his face to the ground before his father. And David kissed him. It should have been a resolution. It was not. Absalom was magnificent to look at. From the sole of his foot to the top of his head, there was no blemish in him. He had hair so heavy that when he cut it once a year, it weighed 5 pounds by the king's weight. He was the kind of man that people noticed, and he knew it, and he used it. He acquired a chariot and horses and 50 men to run ahead of him. He rose early every morning and stood by the road to the gate of the city. And when anyone came with a dispute to bring before the king, Absalom would call out to them, ask where they were from, listen to their case, and say, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you. If only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone with a complaint could come to me, and I would see that they received justice." And when they bowed down to him, he reached out and took hold of them and kissed them. He did this to all the Israelites who came to the king with a dispute. And the text says, Absalom stole the hearts of the people of Israel. For years he did this. Then he went to David and asked permission to go to Hebron to fulfill a vow he claimed to have made. David gave his blessing. Go in peace. But when Absalom went to Hebron, he sent messengers throughout all the tribes of Israel with a simple message. When you hear the sound of the trumpets, shout, "Absalom is king in Hebron." 200 men had gone with him from Jerusalem, invited as guests, without knowing anything about the conspiracy. Absalom also sent for Ahithophel, one of David's most trusted counselors, and the grandfather of Bathsheba, a detail the text drops quietly without comment. And Ahithophel joined the conspiracy. The messenger came to David. The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom." David said to all his officials, "Come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us." David left Jerusalem on foot. He walked out of the city he had taken and built and filled with the presence of God, on foot up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered and his feet were bare. All the people with him covered their heads too, and they were all weeping as they went. A man named Shimei from Saul's clan came out and began cursing him. He threw stones at David and all the king's officials, even though all the troops and the special guard were on David's right and left. He called David a murderer, a scoundrel, and said this was what God was doing to him for all the blood of Saul's family he had spilled. Abishai, one of David's fighters, said, "Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head." David said, "Let him curse. If he is cursing because the Lord said to him, 'Curse David,' who can ask, 'Why do you do this?' Leave him alone. Let him curse." He walked on through the dust and the stones and the curses, barefoot, his head covered, weeping, and he did not look back at the city. Back in Jerusalem, Absalom entered with his forces and took possession. Ahithophel, his counselor, advised him immediately and publicly to do something that would make the break with his father absolute and irreversible: to take David's concubines, the women David had left behind to care for the palace. It was a claim of complete succession, a statement of total victory, and it was designed to be something that could not be undone, a commitment too visible to walk back. Absalom did it. Among the counselors around Absalom was a man named Hushai, who had arrived in Jerusalem weeping and disheveled, who had been accepted as a new ally by Absalom's people, but who was actually David's agent, sent back into the city by David to frustrate the advice of Ahithophel. Ahithophel advised Absalom to pursue David immediately, that very night, while he was exhausted and demoralized, before he could regroup. The plan was sound. Military experts, the text suggests, recognized it as sound. But Hushai offered different counsel. He inflated the danger, described David's men as fierce fighters like a bear robbed of her cubs, suggested that a single defeat early on could shatter morale and ruin everything. "Wait," he said, "gather all of Israel from Dan to Beersheba, as many as the sand of the sea, and then march against him." Absalom and the elders chose Hushai's advice over Ahithophel's. When Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and set out for his hometown. He put his house in order and hanged himself and was buried in his father's tomb. The delay gave David time to cross the Jordan and reorganize. The battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. Absalom's army was routed. 20,000 men fell, and the forest consumed more people that day than the sword. Absalom himself was riding his mule under the large branches of an oak tree when his head caught in the tree. His mule kept going, and he was left there, suspended between heaven and earth. Someone saw this and reported it to Joab. Joab took 3 javelins and drove them into Absalom's heart. Then 10 of Joab's armor-bearers surrounded Absalom and struck and killed him. A runner was sent to David with the news of the victory. Then another runner was sent with the more specific news of Absalom's death. David was sitting between the inner and outer gates when the watchman called down that a runner was coming, and then a second runner. The first arrived, and reported the victory. David asked, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" The runner could not answer the question. The second arrived. He said, with what seems like a misunderstanding of how David would receive it, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man." David understood. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. And as he went, he said, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. O Absalom, my son." The victory that day was turned into mourning for all the troops. They came back stealthily into the city, the way troops steal and who are ashamed when they flee from battle. Joab came to the king and rebuked him. He said, "You have humiliated today all the men who saved your life by loving those who hate you and hating those who love you. If Absalom had lived and all of us had died, it would have pleased you well. Now go out and encourage your servants. I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a man will remain with you by nightfall. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come on you from your youth until now." David got up and sat in the gateway. All the troops came before him. They had their victory, and their king was present to receive it. The return to Jerusalem was complicated and slow. The political landscape had shifted in ways that required careful navigation. Different factions competed to escort the king back. Shimei, the man who had cursed and thrown stones at David on the way out, came forward with 1,000 men from Benjamin to meet him at the Jordan, and he fell down before the king and said, "May my lord not hold me guilty. Do not remember how your servant did wrong on the day my lord the king left Jerusalem. Abishai again. Should Shimei not be put to death for this?" David said no. This is not a day for execution. He swore to Shimei that he would not put him to death. Mephibosheth came too, Jonathan's lame son who ate at the king's table. He had not gone with David when the king fled. His servant Ziba had told David that Mephibosheth had stayed behind hoping to reclaim Saul's kingdom. Mephibosheth's own explanation was different. He had been betrayed by Ziba, who had saddled his donkey for him, but then left without him, and Mephibosheth had been unable to travel on his own. He had been mourning the whole time, not grooming himself, not changing his clothes, from the day David left until the day he returned safely. David told him to say no more, and divided the land between Mephibosheth and Ziba, perhaps not entirely satisfied with either account. There were more struggles, more conflicts, the embers of the Civil War taking some time to cool entirely. There was a revolt, briefly, led by a man named Sheba. There were famines and their complicated causes, and negotiations with the Gibeonites, and battles with the Philistines and their giants. The kingdom held. David held it. But the edges of his reign had a texture that the early years did not. Harder, more worn, more complicated by consequence. He was no longer young. Near the end of his reign, David made a decision that the text treats as a serious failure. He ordered a census of the fighting men of Israel and Judah. Joab, who was many things but not without his own code, tried to talk him out of it. Why does my lord the king want to do this? Why should he bring guilt on Israel? The king's word overruled Joab. The census went ahead. It took 9 months and 20 days. The final count was 800,000 able-bodied men in Israel and 500,000 in Judah. After it was done, David was troubled. He knew he had done something wrong. He said to God, "I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant." The sin is difficult to parse entirely. There are different interpretations that a census represented a kind of appropriation of the people, treating them as a resource for the king's use rather than as people who belonged, in the end, to God, or that it represented a misplaced reliance on military numbers rather than on the provision that had always been the actual source of David's victories. Whatever the precise nature of the failure, the text treats it as real. A prophet came to David with three options: 3 years of famine, 3 months of fleeing before your enemies, 3 days of plague. Choose. David chose to fall into the hand of God rather than into the hands of men. Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great. Do not let me fall into human hands. There was a plague. 70,000 people died. And when the angel of God reached Jerusalem, stretching out his hand to destroy it, the Lord relented and said to the angel, "Enough. Withdraw your hand." The angel was at the threshing floor of a man named Araunah the Jebusite. David saw the angel there, between earth and heaven, with a drawn sword extended over Jerusalem, and David and the elders fell face down. David said, "I am the one who has sinned and done wrong. These are but sheep. What have they done? Let your hand fall on me and my family." God sent Gad the prophet to tell David to build an altar on the threshing floor of Araunah. David went to Araunah and asked to buy the threshing floor. Araunah offered to give it to the king for free: the site, the oxen, the wood, everything. A generous man in an extraordinary moment, making a generous offer. David said, "No, I insist on paying you for it. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing." He paid 50 shekels of silver for the threshing floor and the oxen. He built an altar there and offered burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. The plague on Israel was stopped. And on that threshing floor, on the site where David had bought and built and offered his costly sacrifice, his son Solomon would one day build the temple. David was old. His servants covered him with blankets, but he could not keep warm. There were complications, political maneuverings within the court about the succession. Another son, Adonijah, attempting to position himself as king before the transition was formally arranged. Bathsheba and Nathan came to David and reminded him of his promise. It was Solomon who was to follow him. David stirred himself, gave the necessary orders, and Solomon was anointed king while David was still alive. The trumpet was blown, and the people shouted, "Long live King Solomon." Adonijah's attempt collapsed. The various parties who had aligned with him scattered. Solomon was established. David was dying. He called Solomon to him. His final words to his son, as the text records them, had two registers. The first was personal and profound. Be strong. Show yourself a man. Walk in obedience to God, in his ways, keeping his decrees and commands. If you do this, God will keep his promise to me, that my descendants would not fail to have someone on the throne of Israel. The second register was harder. There were old debts, old injuries, old matters that David had not resolved during his own reign and that he now handed to Solomon to settle. He named names. He gave instructions. Joab, who had shed the blood of Abner and Amasa, deal with him according to your wisdom. Do not let his gray head go down to the grave in peace. Shimei, who cursed me with a vile curse the day I went to Mahanaim, bring his gray head down to the grave in blood. And then Show kindness to the sons of Barzillai the Gileadite, and let them be among those who eat at your table. He helped me when I fled from your brother Absalom. The ledger of a long life settled at the end. Gratitude and consequence both addressed in the same breath. Then David rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. He had reigned 40 years over Israel, 7 years and 6 months in Hebron over Judah, and 33 years in Jerusalem over all Israel and Judah. He was gone. It is worth sitting quietly for a moment with what David was. He was a man of extraordinary gifts and significant failures. He was a poet who wrote some of the most enduring lines in the literature of the ancient world, lines that people still read and still feel the shape of, lines about being pursued by enemies through dark valleys, about God being a shepherd and a rock and a fortress and a refuge. He understood sorrow from the inside. He understood what it felt like to be hunted, to be afraid, to lose everything, to carry guilt that would not lift. And he wrote about all of it with an honesty that does not hide or prettify. He was a warrior who refused, on 2 separate occasions in a cave and on a hillside, to take an easy victory that was within his grasp. Something in him believed, against the pressure of the immediate moment and against the advice of the people around him, that some things cannot be rushed, that power given prematurely, even to a deserving person, does not sit right. He waited for decades for the crown that had been promised to him, and he waited without becoming bitter, without becoming ruthless. He was a king who made a catastrophic moral failure in the middle of his reign, who had a man killed to cover a wrong he had done, and who, when the prophet came and held the story up in front of him, said simply, "I have sinned. No deflección, no elaborate justification, no strategy to escape the consequence, just a plain acknowledgement of what he had done." And then he lived with the consequence, which was severe, which took from him things he loved deeply, and he did not shake his fist at it. He was a father who failed his children in ways he could not fully repair, who was too slow to act when Amnon wronged Tamar, who mourned Absalom with a grief that suggests he understood, too late, that the distance between them had never had to be as large as it was. He was a friend who kept a promise made in a forest to a prince who had loved him well, keeping it years after the prince was dead, in the kindness shown to a lame young man who sat at his table and ate with the king's sons. He was none of these things without the others. The courage and the failure, the poetry and the violence, the extraordinary loyalty and the devastating betrayal, they all belong to the same man. The Psalms he wrote are still sung. They have been sung for 3,000 years in languages David never heard, in places David never imagined, by people who find in his words something that sounds like their own interior lives put into lines. This is perhaps the strangest and most durable legacy of all, that a shepherd boy who became a king, who danced in the streets and wept on a rooftop and walked barefoot out of his own city in the rain, wrote things that still reach people in the middle of the night when nothing else does. The sword that was never far from his house, the grief that lived inside his success, the specific shape of his particular life, all of it is gone now. The palace is dust. The city has been rebuilt a dozen times over. The people who cheered for him are long past remembering, but the words remain. How long, Lord, will you forget me? Forever? The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Out of the depths I cry to you, Lord. Weeping may stay for the night, but rejoicing comes in the morning. Words written in tents and palaces and wilderness, in the dark middle of a human life that was not simple, by a man who was not simple, who believed in something larger than himself and could not always live up to that belief and kept coming back to it anyway. This was David, shepherd, poet, soldier, king, beloved and broken, and, in the end, simply a man who kept walking toward the thing he believed in, even when the road was long and the way was dark and the morning was a long time coming. The fire is low now. The city of David is quiet. Somewhere under the stones of that ancient hill, in the sleep that has no more waking, a king is resting at last. A final note on the Psalms: there is one more thing worth saying before the story fully closes. The Psalms attributed to David, and tradition attributes a large portion of the Psalter to him, though scholars debate the exact count, are perhaps the most intimate record we have of who he was inside. The official histories tell us what he did. The Psalms tell us what he felt. They are not the psalms of a man who had life figured out. They are not the compositions of someone at peace, looking back from a comfortable distance. They were written, most of them, in the middle of things, in the wilderness, under pursuit, in the grip of guilt, in the aftermath of loss, in the disorienting space of not knowing what was coming next. They have the texture of something written because there was no other way to survive the moment except to write it down. Psalm 22 begins, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish?" That is not the opening of a man who has arrived somewhere safe. That is the opening of a man in the dark, calling out into what might be silence. Psalm 51, which the text connects to the aftermath of Bathsheba, is one of the most unflinching pieces of personal accountability in all of ancient literature. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. He does not explain. He does not justify. He asks for mercy from a position of having nothing to offer in return except honesty. In Psalm 23, the most famous of them all, the one that has been read at more bedsides and gravesides than perhaps any other piece of writing in human history, that one was written by a man who had actually been a shepherd, who knew what it was to move through terrain that was dangerous, to know that the valley between the high grazing lands and the next place of rest was deep and dark and full of things that could kill a sheep. He was not speaking in abstract metaphor when he wrote about the valley of the shadow of death. He had walked in places like that, with actual animals, in actual darkness, and had come through. The shepherd became the king. The boy in the fields became the man in the palace. The solitary figure with the harp became the center of a civilization. And somehow, through all of it, he kept writing the songs. He kept reaching for the words. He kept trying to say what it was like from the inside to be a human being in a world that was beautiful and terrible in roughly equal measure. This is what he left behind. Not just a kingdom, not just a dynasty, not just the geography of a city that still bears the shadow of his name. He left behind the words, and the words found their way into every language, every century, every dark night that needed something to hold on to. The fire is low now. The city of David is quiet. Somewhere under the stones of that ancient hill, in the sleep that has no more waking, a king is resting at last. Good night.